noon. Hello, my name is Deborah Dwork, and I am the director of the Center for the Study of the Holocaust, Genocide, and Crimes Against Humanity at the Graduate Center, City University of New York. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to the second of our year-long virtual series, In Praise of Books. According to PEN America, we are in the midst of an unprecedented surge of book bans, a situation that, in light of the recent election results, is bound to grow more dire. Protesting that censorship and suppression, we celebrate new scholarship by emerging as well as established scholars prizing their creativity and rigor. I thank our series partners, NYU's Professor Emerita of Hebrew and Judaic Studies, Marion Kaplan, and Stockton University Professor in the Study of Modern Genocide, Raz Segal, who joins today's program as Anna's interlocutor. I thank, too, Center Associate Juan Acevedo, Dr. Eli Karetny, Deputy Director of the Ralph Bunche Institute, and the GC's terrific IT people, Brad Holscher, Steve Thomas, and Eric Williard. Above all, I am grateful to our speakers and to everyone who has tuned in. Thank you for joining us. It is my pleasure to say a few words about our presenters today. Anna Berg is an assistant professor of history at the University of Pennsylvania. Her research sits at the intersection of a rich array of subjects: waste and recycling, film and cities, racism, war, and genocide. Anna has authored 2 books, On Screen and Off, Cinema and the Making of Nazi Hamburg, and the award-winning Empire of Rags and Bones, Waste and War in Nazi Germany, about which she and Raz will speak today. Just one word about what's in Anna's pipeline, a global environmental history of garbage. Raz Segal is an internationally recognized expert on the phenomenon of genocide, who regularly brings his scholarship into public discourse. In addition to scholarly papers in academic journals, Raz publishes op-eds, book reviews, and articles about genocide, state violence, and memory politics in a range of outlets, including The Guardian, LA Times, The Nation, Haaretz, and the Berliner Zeitung. In Raz's pipeline, a book on the distortion, weaponization, and mobilization of Holocaust history in the reproduction of white supremacy and state violence. Anna and Raz will be in conversation with one another. They and I invite you to pose questions in the question function, and they will turn to them during the Q&A period. Anna and Raz, the floor is yours with my gratitude.
Thank you so much, Deborah. And thank you for all the partners and organizers. And it's a pleasure, it's an honor to be in conversation with you about your new award-winning and truly path-breaking book. So let's jump into it. And the first thing that I think a lot of people would be interested to know is how did you get to write this book? How did you get to the topic? I mean, your previous book that Deborah mentioned, which was published a couple of years ago by UPenn Press, On Screen and Off, Cinema in the Making of Nazi Hamburg, deals with articulating and debating, performing, policing Nazism through film production and film consumption in Hamburg. How did you shift from that to studying waste and recycling as an integral part of Nazism and Nazi genocide?
Okay, thank you, Raz, for this question. Before I answer, I just want to extend my thanks also to the organizers, to Deborah, in particular to you, Raz, to the audience. It's really an honor to be here today. I'm very excited to be in conversation with you and to address questions from the audience later. So yes, how did I get to this topic? That's a really, really good question, because it was something that I literally stumbled into. As I was doing the research for my first book, which happened to also be my dissertation and took a long time to actually see the light of day as a book, I was really interested in understanding how film actually integrates into the lives of ordinary people, and particularly how administrators and lower level functionaries were using film both as a tool to represent their vision of what Nazism ought to be, and at the same time also use it as a means to articulate criticisms of the Nazi regime at times, even if that criticism was often muted. And as I was doing this research, I found that in Hamburg, a lot of the welfare workers, anticipating the corrosion of the people's community and anticipating collapse, were making arguments about the ways in which film could corrupt young women and children, induce them to uncontrollably fornicate, even though all of the films passed Nazi censorship. And so they were reviving discourses from the 19th century and the 1920s about smut and trash in film and literature. As I was reading through these sources, in particular the concluding report by welfare workers on the state of smut and trash in Hamburg and the effects on the local war-weary population from 1943, I found in the same folders complaints about people using the ruins as garbage dumps. And I started to wonder, early on, as I was writing my dissertation, what actually is the material connection between the invocation of discourses around smut and trash and the material realities of a bombed out city without infrastructural functioning. And so asking, okay, what happens to waste in war? I figured I need to first understand what happens to waste in general in the Nazi regime. And when I told people that I was interested in exploring this topic, I got a lot of pushback, and a lot of my colleagues were saying that's kind of really inappropriate to sort of think about waste in relation to the Nazi regime, and to think about garbage and genocide in tandem in particular is problematic. And so I kind of kept this on the low and started looking, and it was mind-blowing to me that in every single folder that I looked, there are things about waste, and we just haven't seen it. In every office, every part of the organization of the Nazi regime, the social administration, military administration, policing, it's everywhere. The ways in which the economy ran. And so once I started to understand that the concepts of waste or waste avoidance, waste utilization, resource extension was like a red thread that carried through not just the archives, but also the ideological framework of the managers of the war economy, I started to figure out that this is something that I actually need to write a book about.
Yeah, I mean, I mean, there is a question there. I mean, how do you explain that? You know, first of all, why were people so, discouraging when you brought this up early when you started thinking about this? But, as you argue also, and as is clear from the book, actually, the evidence, right, for the Nazi obsession with waste management and recycling are, everywhere in the archives, right? It, jumps up from everywhere, right? So how is it that yours is the first book on the topic? How do you explain this?
Okay, let me answer the first part of your question first with respect to the pushback. I think there is something very visceral about the nature of garbage and waste, and the ways in which it's often used in public discourse is to disparage. And so I think it's a mundane substance, and in many ways I've feared, and I think the colleagues who warned me also feared, that my work might be seen as either sensationalizing or minimizing the effects and horrors of the Nazi genocide. And obviously, as I explained in the book, that is nothing could be further from my intention, but rather I want to draw attention to the fact that murder was an intimate affair, that the ways in which people found entry into this murderous regime was often through seemingly apolitical practices such as cleanup, salvaging, reusing various materials, to kind of understand how people find ways to justify their actions or their participation through frameworks that actually are recognizable from outside the particular ideology of the Nazi regime. So those were the kinds of things that I wanted to show, and I think I was mindful of the fact, and we should all be mindful that garbage has been in the public sphere in the last couple of weeks in a number of different ways, whether it's floating islands of garbage in the Atlantic commentary and the subsequent discussion over those. So I think there is really a profound danger of treating the subject of waste and garbage lightly and using it merely in a metaphorical way. So I wanted to make sure that I do due diligence to actually make sure that my assumptions and worries were borne out by archival documents, which brings me to the second part of your question, Raz. Why haven't scholars seen this history before? It is, as you say, very true. It is all over the archives. It's not just all over the archives, it's all over the records from the Nuremberg trials, which have been combed over now for decades. And this is something I think that is not the fault of previous scholars. It is precisely at the core of modern waste management infrastructures. We are not supposed to see waste. When we see waste, it is out of place. It is disrupting the ways in which infrastructures are normally supposed to work. We see waste only in moments of crisis. Otherwise, waste is meant to be invisible, and as well as the people who deal with it are meant to be invisible, and the structures that deal with it are meant to be invisible. The ordinary person's interaction with waste is to take it to the bin and take maybe the bin out to the curb, and that's usually the extent of it. When waste disrupts the public sphere, cleansed of the material substances that are deemed to introduce disease and pollution into the public sphere, only when those substances return is our attention drawn to the operation of waste and their visceral, evocative nature. And so I think because of the very critical questions of trying to understand why and how the Holocaust, the Nazi genocide of the Jews and other minorities played out, attention to waste management infrastructure was something that was simply invisible by design.
Yeah, so it's great that you noticed it, Anna. So tell us, maybe lay out some of the key, arguments, the key issues, and then we'll dig a bit further from there. What's the most important for you to tell listeners here about the arguments of the book?
Okay, thank you. There are a number of different arguments that I'm making, and I should probably start by saying that one of my primary guiding interests is to understand how ordinary people participate in horrendous actions and regimes while maintaining a sense of themselves as orderly, decent human beings. Those are those questions are at the core of all of my work, to understand what allows people who otherwise think of themselves as ordinary to participate in extraordinary crimes. And understanding Nazi Germany as a waste regime, I think, which is what I'm arguing in the book, to illustrate how waste management was at the center of the regime's imperial war and the Nazi genocide, allows us to move beyond arguments around the contrasting tension between whether an ideological framework is primarily to blame or various self-radicalizing structural elements, but actually shows their connections and how they are connected. So by understanding the ideological tenets that the Nazi regime laid out for itself, as imagining Germans to be a spaceless people, in need of territory in order to exploit natural resources, and at the same time beleaguered by both external and internal enemies, we see how the regime linked economic thinking to a defensive framework around racial others and external enemies. Waste, in my view, shows us how the Nazi regime actually was able to combine the imperial agenda with an economic agenda, with a racial agenda, by claiming that Germany doesn't have resources and is at the same time beleaguered. It invited Germans to participate in a project of resource extension, recycling, salvage, in the name of frugality and thrift and orderly behaviors. And ordinary Germans participated in this project, extending resources constantly. And even though it was very clear that the resources were intended to be used to enable the Nazi war machine and imperial expansion, which would then provide the sort of utopia of plenty for a German nation. Waste management and recycling in particular functioned as a sort of interim implement to bridge the imagined resource gap. And in the name of German autarky and food freedom and so on and so forth. But by doing so, invited ordinary people to participate by invoking a sort of universal language of cleanup, frugality, and thrift that found appeal often independent of whether or not people found themselves drawn to the virulent anti-Semitic and racist rhetoric of the regime. So basically showing how ideological convictions are not necessarily necessary for the participation of ordinary people is one of the main through lines of the book, and how the sort of understanding of what is clean and what is dirty, of what is the category of waste as both a revolting object on the one hand, and on the other, a valuable resource, allows for a dynamism of moving both people and things into and out of the category of waste in ways that the invocation of garbage then will nonetheless evoke a visceral reaction, whether or not that polluting substance is imaginary or real, whether it is related to imagined or actual possibility for disease. And so there, I think the Nazi regime was able to tap into existing structures and frameworks of understanding sanitation and health more broadly in the Western world, that is at the core of how it was able to mobilize people systematically and often without them noticing the precise implications thereof in a genocidal imperial war of expansion and destruction.
Yeah, I mean, so waste itself actually as kind of an ideology and practice together in a way, but we'll touch on this a bit more later. But I want to actually, in relation to what you said, you know, situating the Nazi project as an integral part of thinking about waste and waste management in the West, perhaps. So, you know, your book, I think quite clearly joins, you know, a significant body of scholarship in the last 20 years that challenges the idea of, you know, Nazism and the Holocaust as unique or exceptional or unprecedented, or, you know, whatever word you want to use in order basically to continue to uphold the hierarchy represented in this kind of strange combination that is the title of our field, Holocaust and Genocide Studies, right? And, you know, specifically you place the Nazi obsession with recycling in the frame of Nazi empire building and extraction as part of, you know, modern and late modern context of European imperialism, colonialism, and racial capitalism. So could you talk a bit more about this, you know, placing Nazism in this broad context, and what are the specific elements of the Nazi case in this broad context? What are the implications, you know, in view of your work of continuing to think about the Nazi case as unique, which, you know, of course, outside of the academic world is very, very strong, this idea, but also inside the academic world continues to be strong in many ways. And what do we gain by letting go of this hierarchy, right?
Thank you. As is probably evident from my book, I don't find the conversation or argument around the uniqueness of the Holocaust or of the Nazi regime more broadly particularly helpful in understanding the particularities of the case. I think historians always compare, even if we then reject similarities that we perhaps investigate. So I think on one level, it's really, it's a very politically charged conversation that often, I think, detracts from the very well-intentioned questions that people bring to the study of the Holocaust and the Nazi regime. So that to be said up front. My goal really is to understand how knowledge travels and how whether or, like there's no doubt that every event and the development in history has unique traits or singular traits or whatever term you want to use, but at the same time nothing exists in isolation. And in order to understand how people were using, learning, appropriating technologies, and how also with the collapse of the Nazi regime, the continuation of appropriation and learning is something that we can't dismiss. It's something that is fundamentally interesting to me, historically interesting. And so with respect to waste and recycling in particular, I think we see that while the ways in which the Nazi regime brought this waste regime into play and in an extreme fashion is really something I haven't seen anywhere else. There are aspects of this that are really quite different from the sort of salvaging campaigns that characterizes nations at war. What we are seeing, however, is a different kind of relationship between other empires that I think previously was perhaps overshadowed by some of the internal contradictions within the Nazi empire building, which is to say that the Nazis were after what we would call quote unquote ordinary resources, such as oil, iron ore, and other kind of natural resources. They were intending to build up infrastructures of extraction that we are familiar with from other imperial contexts, but given the short duration of the regime, thankfully, those infrastructures were not successfully built up. What my work, I think, shows is that, however, by focusing on the concept of extraction and understanding extraction as resource production, we understand both the labor that goes into the extraction of resources in the quote-unquote ordinary imperial context, such as mining endeavors in the Americas or in Africa, as well as the mining of people that the Nazis engaged in when they were mining ordinary citizens of occupied territories and Jews in particular for clothing, shoes, and hair. To understand the resource production and the labor entailed in making resource out of secondary materials or waste products. So that in my understanding, what we can see is that while the intentions were similar, because the war kind of impeded the sort of ordinary extraction of resources, the mining of secondary materials, both inside the Reich and in the occupied territories, is not fundamentally different. In fact, we can see a similarity between the extraction of resources or the production of resources out of waste products, where the Nazis don't differentiate between junk and jewels. Anything that might still hold a shred of value is subject to extraction because of the postulated resource scarcity that powers this regime in order to be able to enable itself to build up infrastructures of extraction that we are familiar with from other contexts. So even though the Nazi empire's extractivist endeavors were not profitable in the free market sense of the term, they were intended to provide the intermittent implement to power the war economy. And I think there we can see a fundamental, or we can recognize economic structures of extraction and destruction that we see in other places and and in other time periods.
So, I first of all, to everyone who's listening, please feel free to, post your questions as we move forward in the Q&A. Some of you have, and I actually want to integrate one of those questions now in relation to, thinking my question, and then I'll read the question that we have here on the Q&A, is in relation to that. Is there any insights that we can glean from your analysis of the Nazi obsession with recycling as a central element, of course, of their war economy, about our own obsession with, because we also live in a society that is quite obsessed with recycling, right? Of course, in a very different context, right? But is there something there, or is this completely, so different that we can't glean any insight? But then let me just add a question from the audience here related to this. I'm fascinated by your argument that the German citizens were encouraged to embrace austerity as a patriotic duty. It is something that we don't think about very often, especially when the most prominent Nazi leaders were certainly overconsumptive. Do you see any parallels in the way large industries and oligarchs foist the impetus on the common people to, quote, stop using plastic straws, for instance, while continuing to drill for fossil fuels? So, somewhat challenging, but...
It's challenging, but it's something that I sort of foreshadow very in a very small way in the conclusion of my book, because I do think actually they are connected, and we can actually see some similarities, even if not in the ways that perhaps first jump to mind, that the Germans today are obsessed with recycling and have all these color-coded bins and fines for placing the wrong substance in the wrong bin. So I don't think that this kind of particular obsession is the same or even similar. What I do think we see is that understandings of how do I say this? Understandings of waste management that obscure the importance of labor is something where I see the continuities. So in the Nazi case, they were able to sanitize the process of recycling because they resorted almost exclusively to forced and incarcerated labor, meaning concentration camp inmates, forced laborers dragged off in literal slaves hunt from Nazi-occupied Eastern Europe, particularly Soviet territories and Poland, were forced to do society's shit work, so to speak. Germans could pride themselves in being clean, in being frugal, without ever actually having to deal with the dirtiness of the material substances. And I'm talking about, for example, animal cadaver processing or bone processing, the sanitation of clothing robbed from victims, and the subsequent shredding and respinning the fabrics into cloth, and the fashioning of prisoner uniforms and army uniforms out of that cloth. That kind of labor was almost exclusively assigned to people that the Nazis themselves deemed expendable, primarily Jews and civilian workers in the occupied territories, as well as concentration camp inmates inside Germany, of course. But the brunt of this kind of labor was performed under horrendous conditions and duress, constant violence in the ghettos in occupied Poland and in the occupied territories in the East. So obviously it's very different from the kind of recycling that we are inspired to engage in today. However, the parallel I see is in the role of individuals. We are encouraged nowadays to separate our garbage in the name of a greener future, with thinking about our individual responsibility, whereas we are usually, most of us, not taking this any further than placing a substance into a specific bin. The labor that is actually required to recycle the materials that we sort is hidden from most of us. It is nonetheless, for the most part, still performed by society's sub-persons, or even outsourced to poor countries altogether. To most of us, this remains largely invisible, and it's actually weaponized by oligarchs, industries, in the name of a kind of a greenwashing ideology, where we as individuals are supposed to recycle in the name of being good citizens, whereas industry pollutes on a scale that actually dwarfs, and I will provide some statistics that dwarfs the contribution of individual consumers. And that is something I think that is really interesting, because in the American context, the average American takes about 100 tons of garbage to the curb over the course of their lifespan. The American system produces 2,700 tons of garbage on behalf of each and every American. Our admonitions for recycling focus on the 100 tons that each and every one of us has control over. So even the fantasy of zero waste in today's time actually fails to account for the vast majority of waste, such as mining waste, industrial emissions, industrial wastes more generally speaking. That is one parallel, I think, that is really important, how the extractivist nature of our system today actually obscures its own function. And waste management is a key element in obscuring the destructive nature of this apparatus as well. The other, I think, important lesson that we can learn is somewhat in reverse, is that the Nazi regime was one of the first, and the Soviet Union is the other, regime that actually focused, that extended a focus on waste beyond consumer waste, but actually targeted industrial waste and recognized the sort of importance of waste minimization and resource extension within the framework of their operations, while, like our systems, completely ignoring the waste produced in the effects of military destruction, even though the Nazis tried to recycle that as well. But not necessarily they produced essentially the resources that they subsequently exploited ad nauseum by the waging of war. So I think there are some interesting connections, even though I wouldn't call them parallels or direct lines of connections, that help us to think about the destructive systems and how our relationship with waste products, or how waste or garbage are invoked, actually produce very similar kinds of responses, irrespective of the ideological framework in which we live. Waste is something that is deemed a problem, and a problem that needs to be dealt with. And so the current nature of waste management and in the Nazi regime, as well as in other contexts as well, invites ordinary people to do something that appears to be inherently good, to maintain order, to clean up. Whereas the destructive elements of each of these systems are in part obscured by precisely those practices. Sorry, that was a very long answer.
No, that was good. There's also a comment here about how this speaks very closely to the role of the Dalits in India and its categorical caste system as a way for managing, and the social order, also in relation to waste and cleanup and these kinds of things. So I think, very important connection, despite, significant differences, of course. As you said, I mean, differences and similarities, that's what comparisons are, right? That's kind of it's not supposed to be controversial to think comparatively at all. But I think when we do that, as you just demonstrated, we learn some very significant things, or at least we raise some questions about our own life. So that was, I think, very important. I want to move a bit, to, your book presents a picture of Nazi Germany, both at home and in the vast areas that it's occupied and controlled, really as a mess, right? And that's, I mean, that in itself is not, we know this from a lot of other research as well, right? But you paint a picture of an extremely, violent system of racial capitalism based on a vision of cutting-edge scientific and technological innovation that in practice, however, continuously failed, and in the process exposing, magical thinking and ultimately collapsing onto itself as the tide of war turned clearly against Germany after 1942, really until the horrifically bitter end. So could you, elaborate a bit on how the book adds to, or, opens again, perhaps, discussions on the tension in Nazi Germany between rational planning. You touched upon this a bit, but, between rational planning and policies, and then ideology, right? Elaborate a bit more on this. What does your book, bring us that is new to this discussion?
Yeah, so one of the main tensions I think that scholars have pointed to is the tension that the Nazi regime claimed to have a severe labor shortage, and yet it murdered its slave labor force systematically. Right, that is kind of the core tension that has often been invoked to explain why Nazism and the Holocaust are different from other genocides. That Nazis murdered Jews only because they were Jews, and there were no other rational reasons that explain the Nazi excess. Whereas in other contexts, that is not the case. And this is not my argument. This is something that other scholars have argued. In my work, I try to show that that's actually not the case, that the contradiction at the center of the Nazi genocide was actually at least partially resolved through Nazi ideology and through waste management. And let me try to explain this. The fact that the Nazi regime experienced drastic labor shortages and resource scarcity, at least during the war, the economic measure was to utilize populations deemed inherently inferior to extract labor power from them in order to produce resources out of waste products, essentially. We are not talking about high-tech industrialized operations here, even though there are examples of a more Taylorist SS operations as well. However, for the most part, these are just brutal labor regimes of forcing people for 12 hours into shifts to extract, to turn waste into resources, okay? However, the materials that we're talking about are not, as I said, like high technical materials or high value materials that require specific knowledge and know-how, so that once the Nazi regime military successes ensure a seemingly constant supply of fresh laborers from the Soviet territories, the Nazi regime encounters a problem of not too few workers, but quote unquote, too many eaters. And that's when I think the logic becomes inherently destructive, when people's labor is exploited, but as a function of how many calories they consume. So where the question around food security and food resources and essential war material production kind of comes into conflict. And the conflict is literally fought out on the backs of the most vulnerable people, whose labor power is extracted, and when it is depleted, people are cast aside. In order to address the question that you asked, Raz, about the sort of, magical thinking and technological sophistication, on the other hand, to this kind of really dirty, brutal extraction of labor and waste materials, I think these are not mutually incompatible or even contradictory, that high-tech thinking and knowledge went into thinking about how to turn various inferior materials into useful war material, so that it invited, actually, and created opportunities, pioneer space for scientists, planners, on a number of different levels, even individual entrepreneurs who would develop ideas about how to harness the protein for example, that is a residue of potato processing in the liquid that is reserved, to press that into pills for German warriors, for example, as like so there is not necessarily a contradiction, that actually this focus on making something from nothing invited a whole host of visionaries to participate and in the endeavor to innovate resources out of waste products. At the same time, by paying attention to Nazi ideological frameworks, that makes it essential to salvage, be frugal in order to power the operations of war, we see that this becomes kind of like an automated logic, and I'm going to try to explain what I mean by this. So if you think that recycling or reutilizing materials or salvaging or avoiding the squander of resources, if that is sort of the framework that you're operating with, then even when the recycling or salvaging campaigns that the Nazis orchestrate compete directly with the allocation of fuel resources and other resources, and actually are on an economical level wasteful, the ideology of this is a good thing is not called into question, because the overall implosion of the regime kind of obscures the reasons for why there is scarcity. The war is blamed for the scarcity, and recycling is associated with a remedy, so that even when recycling is not delivering the desired results, it is something that people resort to because it has been understood as kind of the only room for action in a regime that deliberately constricted the possibilities for individual action.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you speak to a broader phenomena of how we tend to think about ideology and say rational economic considerations and say in conflict, whereas from within a particular ideological framework, they're not actually in conflict and definitely not understood on a daily basis, right? As in conflict. And in that sense, again, the Nazis, or people who lived in Nazi Germany, right, were not, in any way exceptional in that sense, right? Okay. So maybe moving through this now to, again, back to the, the way that you discuss the complicity of, ordinary Germans, right? Mm-hmm. In their daily routines, right, until the very end of the war, followed the state precepts, basically, of what we call today zero waste, basically, right? And could, probably imagine their actions as apolitical, right? And, you describe them, for example, with words such as, unthinkingly, acting unthinkingly. So is there anything that, indeed, following, my comment just now, that we can learn from this about how people, let's be more specific, how we imagine our daily lives in relation to state violence?
Okay, if I wanted to be provocative, I'd say that in order to save democracy, we should now all start throwing garbage in the streets. But that's obviously not to be taken seriously. Rather, I think what we are seeing is that what I like to show with this book is that there are certain practices that people engage in unthinkingly. A lot of those, I think, we find in sort of systems of social reproduction, whether it is, making the mail arrive on time or the trains run on time, like ordinary things that seem to make a society function and appear orderly, right? And I'm not saying that, and so obviously people participated in those kinds of actions as well. But I think what makes waste management unique in that context is that it forges an association between orderly behavior on the one hand, and dirty, unwanted substances that are outsourced to dirty, unwanted populations, which in the case of other infrastructural maintenance is not the case. So that waste and waste management tends to marry ideological frameworks that determine social hierarchies in ways that is often opaque to people participating in it. So our recycling, we talked about this before, is the actual recycling labor is done for the most part either by prison populations in the United States when it comes to e-waste recycling, for example, or by populations in the quote unquote global South. We export a lot of our waste for recycling to other parts of the world where that labor is performed. And so I think at the same time, the action of participating in the sort of project of recycling is defined in our society as an ultimate good. And even though we know that if each and every one of us does our part, the climate apocalypse will not be averted. It kind of is a distraction. It implicates us in the maintenance of a system that clearly is not sustainable. And I think that is the parallel, perhaps, that is most applicable to the Nazi case. Germans at the end of the war were freighting materials, literally junk, back to the shrinking Reich. At the same time that they forced people to march on foot, shot an indiscriminate number of individuals, dispensed with their livelihoods while kind of hunting after junk, because they had bought into an idea that only materials that could perhaps still be used in some shape or form would be able to turn the tides of the war. And in some ways, I think that our fetishization of recycling is somewhat similar, in that we know that the mode of production that Western capitalism is engaged in is destroying the planet. And recycling is not an implement that will avert or mitigate that particular problem. And yet it is sort of advertised as the end-all, be-all cure to the current climate problems.
Indeed. So, I want to ask you about, your next project, which, kind of follows from this. But before that, there's like a brief question. There's another question that from the audience that if you can address quick, as briefly as you can, is do you see parallels, right, between the Nazi case and current settler colonial states and violations of indigenous people's rights, including environmental pollution and indeed extraction, right, by industries in other countries? Gosh, I wonder which country we were talking about, but
do I see parallels? Like, yes, I think maybe I wouldn't use the term parallels. I do think I see something like a Verwandtschaft, or I don't know actually how to translate that best, but a conceptual relationship between these practices that actually tend to privilege a certain sense of industrial superiority by applying technological regimes to extract quote unquote natural resources that are in the process naturalized, the labor obscured. So I think the parallels or the relationships are more in the processes than in the Nazis did it just like someone else. But the understanding really that lands, territory, natural resources, human labor are to be mined and utilized, I think, are at the core of settler colonial projects and neo-imperialist projects, actually.
there's also this idea, I think about progress, right? That there are, people who we will arrive at whatever vision progress, quote unquote, dictates, right? And they could be Jews or Slavs in the Nazi view, and they could be indigenous people in other views. Again, doesn't mean that this is exactly the same by any means, but it means that there's some kind of a connection also in the ideological frameworks, I think.
Yeah, I agree.
So let's, I want to with this, you've given us a lot, a lot to think about from your book, and really everyone read the book, teach the book. It's so important, which makes me very excited to hear more about your next book, right? So tell us a bit, where do you go, how do you build on this, or where do you go from this? What are you working on now? Give us a bit about this.
Okay, so I have two projects. One follows directly from Empire of Rags and Bones, because I wanted to say again.
Me too. That's it.
Oh, well, there's maybe a third, but I won't talk about that. And that follow-up project basically investigates what happens to the piles of junk freighted back to the Reich at the end of the war. We're obviously familiar with the piles of shoes and clothing and other personal items that were found by the liberating allies in Nazi concentration camps, both in Nazi-occupied Poland and inside Germany. But in addition to that, the train cars filled with all sorts of other material, like I have no idea where that went after the war. So the next book is really trying to understand like what happens with this material after the war, and in particular, how do Germans actually use their recycling credentials in the aftermath of collapse to place themselves at the disposal of the Allied occupiers and advance themselves as the title of the book, or the envisioned title of the book argues, a nation of cleaners, where essentially in the two post-war Germanys, lessons learned about particular kinds of use value and the ways in which to recycle them have an afterlife and continue. Like in the immediate aftermath, that's already part of the book that I've already written. Germans have rubble recycling facilities and are really trying to figure out how the ways in which they had been functioning in the last several years of the war might actually extend resources in peacetime. And so I'm trying to trace how this particular endeavor it becomes divorced from Nazi ideology at the same time that is being placed in the service of new, revamped, imagined German identities that track with both the Federal Republic on the one hand and the German Democratic Republic on the other. So that's one project. The other, which is the one that I will write first because it's already under contract and I'm already late, is a global environmental history of garbage that is really trying to explore the simultaneous development of sanitation infrastructures and policing infrastructures, to think about the relationship between ideas of securitization on the one hand and hygiene and questions of both racial and health-related forms of purity, and trace that from through the 19th and 20th centuries to understand the implications of waste management and the sort of invisibility of the destructive nature of waste management infrastructures across the globe, and the exportation of ideas of cleanliness, purity, sanitization, efficiency, and so on and so forth through European imperialism across the world.
Wow. What's the third? Well, Anna, that was very much looking forward to, to the next book, and also to the one about what happened to the piles. Thank you so much. Again, I think you've given us a lot to consider, to think about. Very provocative, but also, very, very strong analytically, and based on amazing research. So thank you so much. It was also just a pleasure, as always, to speak with you, Anna. And Deborah,
I jump back on. I jump back on to say thank you. Thank you, Raz, for the really wonderful questions. And thank you, Anna, for the riveting and informative responses. We've just begun composting in my apartment building. And now I'm rethinking the whole ideology of composting and the labor of composting. So in ways large and very small, your knowledge illuminates. And I thank you for that. I also thank every single person who has tuned in today. I hope that you have a wonderful afternoon and that you will continue to recycle, even if we know it avails us not. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you so much.